Property taxes are among the oldest and most important forms of taxation in the United States. They fund schools, police, and fire departments, local roads, libraries, and countless other local services. Yet few Americans understand how property taxes are assessed, why assessments can generate controversy, or why scholars continue to debate whether the system is fair. To help us better understand these issues, I am pleased to welcome Professor Christopher Berry of the University of Chicago, one of the nation's leading experts on municipal finance and property taxation, and his research has examined how assessment practices can affect taxpayers in different communities. Hello, I am Marvin King, and this is Civic Lens. Chris, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me on, Marvin. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Let's start with the basics. What exactly is a property tax?
Well, a property tax is an annual tax that owners pay based on the value of the property they own. So in principle, it would be best understood as a percentage of your property's value that you pay in taxes every year. Usually that would be something on the order of anywhere between 1% to 2%, depending on the jurisdiction you live in. But if you own a home, you'll end up paying like something on the order of 1% to 2% of that home's value in taxes every year.
Why do local governments rely so heavily on property taxes? Or maybe I should ask, do they rely so heavily on property taxes?
They do rely heavily on property taxes. The property tax is still the single most important source of revenue for local governments. This has been declining over time to some extent, so they've been relying increasingly on other kinds of taxes, but the property tax remains the single most important tax. And as to why, this is a great tradition in local government that predates the United States and really predates the state government. So let's just stick with the U.S. for now. Before we had states, we had colonies. Colonies were largely comprised of towns and kind of local governments. And the property tax, really from time immemorial, has been how local governments fund themselves. And the reason is it's relatively easy to administer locally in terms of you can have a local tax assessor or sheriff who can figure out the value of property with some degree of accuracy and levy taxes. And of course, at this pre-industrial time, most wealth was tied up in land. And so you could see the taxing of property as being a way to get at the greatest source of wealth that would likely be in a community. And over time, that tradition has lived on in the United States, and still to this day, local governments face some legal restrictions on what other kind of taxes they can use. So, for example, in most states, local governments are not allowed to levy income taxes, the other major source of revenue, say for federal and state governments. Some, but not all local governments can levy sales taxes. But really, based on tradition and sort of legal restrictions, the property tax is one of the uniquely local taxes that's available to pretty much every local government in the country.
Often states will cap the rate on sales tax, or it has to be approved by the voters. So that can be a challenge. So I can then see why property tax might be a more appealing alternative for municipal governments.
Yeah, that's absolutely correct. They have much more latitude to set their own tax rates when it comes to the property tax as opposed to other kinds. Now, sometimes if they want to borrow money, there'll be referenda, and we could get into like more details. But you're absolutely right that there's much more latitude for local governments to set the rate they want when it comes to the property tax than, say, the sales tax.
I'm a property owner, and recently our property value was reassessed, and the value of the house had gone up. And of course, my income did not go up, but the value of the house went up. So of course, my property taxes went up. So how do they go about assessing property values? Do they just look at Zillow?
Well, they don't. They don't in general just look at Zillow, but they do something kind of similar to what Zillow is trying to do. If you are a Zillow user, you're probably familiar with the Zestimate, which is Zillow's, in some sense, best guess about what your home is worth. And assessors are doing something similar in that the standard practice, the details vary from one jurisdiction to the next, but basically what you're going to do as an assessor is you're going to look at all the homes that have sold recently in a jurisdiction. You're going to see the prices that those homes got at sale, and then you're going to relate those price to the features of the home. So, how many square foot, how many bedrooms, is there a fireplace, the usual things that buyers care about. They'll try to then estimate, sometimes using a statistical model, sometimes a little bit more informally, but the relationship between features of a home and the sale price that they've observed in their jurisdiction. And then Of course, that's information they only know about the homes that have sold, but then knowing something about the relationship between, say, square footage and other aspects of the home and their price, they'll try to make inferences about what the homes that didn't sell would have sold for if they had been sold. And that becomes the assessed value of the property.
Now, that seems pretty straightforward, yet we do know many homeowners believe that their assessments might be inaccurate. So, is there a way to measure or determine if there are assessment errors? Because you just laid out a pretty straightforward process. So, where might errors originate from?
Yeah, well, the errors are going to come through the fact that so many of the features of homes that buyers and sellers will get to see are not seen by the assessor. So I laid out really simple logic where we look at the sale price of the home and relate it to its features. But the assessor has to somehow get data on those features, and they don't have really a complete data set, certainly comparable to what would be on something like Zillow. So they're forced to look at a relatively rudimentary set of features that often were recorded when the home was built. And this might be like the year it was built, how many square feet does it have, how many bedrooms does it have? I mean, what material is it constructed from? But there'll be lots of things that the assessor doesn't get to see, like this home has a newly remodeled chef's kitchen or a beautiful bathroom, or this home next door hasn't been maintained in 20 years because an elderly couple lived there on a fixed income, but they have a leaky roof. Those kind of things are generally not seen by the assessor, and legally speaking, assessors generally cannot go inside the house to evaluate it. There's the sort of complex legal doctrine there, but they can't go into your house without your permission. Most assessors don't really even try. And so they won't know much about the current state of the interior of a home. Of course, buyers and sellers, they get to see all this information. And so they're going to base their price on the full totality of the information, whilst the assessor is left with a much more limited set of facts. And so this can definitely lead to assessment errors. And even if the assessor is kind of getting the price right on average, in other words, the average 2,000 square foot property in this jurisdiction might be worth, $300,000. There's going to be a lot of variation around that average based on all these other features that the assessor might not be seeing.
It's not like the assessors can drive by and look at every big dumpster in front of a house and know, okay, they're renovating. So this house, same square footage, but new finishings. So it's going to be
Yes.
worth a lot more.
Absolutely. And assessors are trying to get better at that. Of course, as we have better and better digital information, assessors are able, for example, to go take a peek at the building permits in their jurisdiction. And some assessors and jurisdictions do a better job because these are typically going to be different departments. And while that might seem a trivial distinction, we know how local governments work, and one doesn't always know what the other is doing. So you need your assessor to be in communications with your building department regarding the permits. And of course, I mean, hey, I live in Chicago, but I'm sure this is true everywhere. People don't always like to pull permits, when they're making improvements, because that adds to the cost. And so we have lots of unpermitted improvements that are happening. So even when the assessor does a good job of keeping track of what's kind of on the books, there's a lot of off the book stuff happening too.
I feel like I should do another episode on the underground economy.
Yeah,
There,
absolutely.
there's a lot there. Your research suggests that lower value homes are often assessed less favorably than higher value homes. So, could you explain that finding and what the implication of that would be?
Sure. So first, the finding is exactly as you say, that so first, let's just take a step back and say, how do we know if assessments are accurate? How would you know, either as a homeowner or as an analyst of the system? And basically, we get a great test when homes actually sell. As I was saying earlier, the assessor has to value everybody's home every year. And most years, those homes don't sell, because people don't typically sell their home every year. And so we don't really know. The assessor says your home is worth this amount. You might think it's worth a different amount, but if your home hasn't sold, who's to say? But every year, a bunch of homes in a jurisdiction do sell. And therefore, we can look at the sale price and compare it to the assessed value. And that's essentially what I do. That's what all analysts studying property taxes do, is something called a ratio study, which is it's kind of the proof of concept for the assessor. Hey, you've been telling us the value of the home. It's sold. Let's compare those things. And essentially what we find is that lower valued homes are systematically assessed at more than what they're actually worth, whereas the highest valued homes are systematically assessed at less than what they're worth.
So that's like a tax penalty then for people in lower value homes, if I'm understanding you correctly?
Exactly right, because again, at the end of the day, you pay taxes on what the assessor says the value of your home is, right? The assessed value, not the sale price. And so, if the assessor is overvaluing your home, that's going to directly translate into a higher tax bill than you should be getting. And if the assessor is undervaluing your home, you're going to be getting a tax break that you shouldn't be getting. And so I've studied this tens of millions of transactions around the country. So looking at when these homes sell and then comparing it to what their assessor has said the home is worth. And we find the pattern you described of lower valued homes being overassessed, higher priced homes being underassessed. And this is happening in most jurisdictions in the country to different degrees. Some jurisdictions are worse than others. I think, your natural question would be why, like what's going on? And it goes back to that whole issue of the averaging that we were talking about before, which is to say, like, imagine the assessor were to assess every home as if it were the average one in the jurisdiction. Well, of course, the homes that are above average will be underassessed because they're being treated as if they're average. And the homes that are below average are being overvalued because they're being treated as if they're average. And the way to think about it is that even when the assessor does a good job at, say, figuring out the price per square foot and saying every 2,000 square foot property in my jurisdiction will be assessed at the average price of a 2,000 square foot property, let's say 300,000. Well, those unobservable differences, the fact that there's this leaky roof in one is going to make it lower priced. The fact that there's a remodeled chef's kitchen in the other one is going to make it worth more than average. And it's just inevitable that some of this regressivity is going to come into play because the assessor cannot see all the features that make otherwise, from the outside, seemingly similar homes sell for something different.
I'm curious, we've been talking about everything kind of nationally, but of course, we know that assessment is done at the local level. Are there particular regions or states that do a better job of this, or is it pretty much the same national standards across, and a homeowner would expect the same outcomes, if you will, in Mississippi versus West Virginia?
Yes, there's huge variation in terms of the quality of assessments from place to place, and I can direct your listeners to a website that we've constructed that will allow you to get a report for your own home jurisdiction if you want to know how things are going on there. This is important because it really only matters if homes are assessed differentially within the same jurisdiction. In other words, if all the high valued homes are in one jurisdiction and all the low valued homes are in a different jurisdiction, it's one being over or under assessed doesn't have any implications for the other. It's only when you're in the same tax base that this matters. So you really need to understand what's going on in your own local jurisdiction to evaluate this. I can tell you that Cook County, where I am now, where Chicago is located, has gone from one of the worst jurisdictions in the country in terms of this problem to one of the better ones due to some reforms that were made here. So you're asking what jurisdictions are doing a good job. Houston is known for having very good assessments for a long time. Seattle. And again, I'll offer up a website where people can look at their own home jurisdiction to see how things are where they are.
I'll put a link to the website in the show notes, but what is the name of the website?
It's Property Tax Project, all one word, propertytaxproject.uchicago.edu. And that's the letter U and the word Chicago as in University of Chicago. So propertytaxproject.uchicago.edu.
I also have a few realtor friends that will listen
Okay.
to this. So if they don't know about it already, I'll make sure that they do know it. I remember doing some research, reading about Alabama a long time ago, where they had a very low property tax because this was back during uh, the post-Civil War days, and the property owners had all the money, the folks who would own thousands of acres. And of course, they were resistant to a property tax. They wanted an income tax or a sales tax or something like that. And so I've wondered if states collectively have kind of evolved, and is the use of property taxes fairly similar across the states, or do some states rely on property tax more? I grew up in Texas, and my dad always complained about the property tax there because we didn't have an income tax in Texas. So he always thought that's how they made up the money.
Yeah, well, for sure. There's huge variation across states in terms of how much they rely on property taxes or not. And as you anticipate, it's partly a function of what other taxes do they utilize. So there's lots of variation in that. And if you've been following the news lately, I think there's all sorts of brewing tax revolts, or you've probably seen Florida, Texas, to give you a couple examples you already mentioned. Other states saying, "Hey, we're going to abolish the property tax." Now, that's more, I think, talk than actually passed legislation. But it's clear that um, there's a sort of anti-property tax sentiment brewing up right now, and I think the real question, and probably the reason why none of these reforms have really turned into anything like an abolition of a property tax, is what else? Where would you get the money? And for the reasons I was alluding to earlier, given that most local governments are unable to collect income taxes, that there are limits on sales taxes, everyone clearly hates the property tax. But if you were to get rid of it, you'd be getting rid of the largest source of revenue, certainly for schools and typically for cities as well. And so the variation from place to place has a lot to do with how much income taxes or sales taxes are allowed, or how much redistribution is coming from the state to the city. But everyone relies on property tax to some extent.
So taxes are a puzzle, and property taxes are clearly a very big piece. They're like the edge piece on a puzzle. Like,
Yeah.
you really need those. If you could implement, given your research and study of this topic, a reform to improve the property tax system, do you have any suggestions?
Yeah, I suppose the reform, I'm going to stop short of abandoning the property tax. I think there's other desirable features of the property tax. So my reform would not be to abolish it. But I think right now it's really almost an unregulated wild west of local assessors doing what they want, and that state governments are really not fulfilling much of a regulatory role on them. And so my reform would be to have state governments really do much stronger audits of their local assessors and the quality of the assessments, and hold them to standards of accuracy and equity across property prices, and really hold them accountable if they're failing to deliver those kind of accurate and fair assessments to their taxpayers.
At the federal level, we would call this oversight.
Yes.
At the state level, maybe this would be your state treasurer. I'm trying to think of what executive agency might have oversight over.
In a lot of states, it's the Department of Revenue
Okay.
that will have this kind of oversight. Uh, and they do have this authority typically. So, as you likely know, local governments are what's called creatures of the state, in the sense that most of the powers local governments have they only have because they've been given to them by the state government. The Constitution doesn't give local governments any powers. And so the states absolutely do have this regulatory authority. It's just that they're typically not using the authority. To give you an example, in Illinois, where I'm from, the Illinois Department of Revenue does relatively simple audits of local jurisdictions every year in terms of the quality of their assessments. And when I first started doing this work, I was finding these widespread inequities in Cook County and elsewhere in Illinois. I was wondering, why isn't the Department of Revenue doing anything about this? And I was able to go to the Department of Revenue website and see, for the past decade's worth of reports, they were finding the same thing. They just weren't doing anything about it. So their requirement was, hey, you have to file this report. And the local jurisdictions were complying by filing the report, but no action was being taken. And so the reform that I have in mind, in answer to your question, is really to have the states take a much more proactive regulatory role, again, with the authority of which they have, to really hold their local assessors accountable for the quality of the work that they do.
And that would also have the benefit of probably reducing the appeals that individual homeowners make, if then the assessors would be able to say, well, look, here's this process that we follow, that the state tells us to follow. And so then I would think on procedural grounds, more of those valuations would hold up.
Absolutely. The better the assessments are to start with, the fewer appeals there should be. And then also, I think people would have more faith in the system. I think one of the problems now, and you mentioned it, you're a homeowner, you recently got a reassessment. One of the problems you have is it's hard to know how accurate that is. So you get the new bill or the new assessment says, hey, we think your home's value went up by 10%. How do you know if it did? You could go do some research on Zillow. There's ways to kind of investigate, but most people, you kind of sort of have to trust that that bill you get and that assessment you get. And the little secret is, it's really hard for you to know unless you see everyone else's tax bill, right? Because it's really not a question so much of how much did your assessment go up, but much did your assessment go up compared to everyone else's in your jurisdiction, right? If every single property's value went up by 10%, then there really be no difference in in the taxes. For most people, that's just an impossible thing to know. Not only what happened to your bill, but what happened to the average bill, and so on. This website that I referred you to is one of the goals of making that, is to provide that information to people. But I think if the state were doing this and just improved people's faith in the system, so that when you got the bill and it said your assessment went up, you that would have some value in your mind. You trust that, not blindly, but at least to a first approximation.
So, as a quick reminder, I've got Chris Berry from the University of Chicago talking to us about property taxes. And before we close, I always like to ask, you've already mentioned the website, which I'd like to ask you to mention again. Do you have any books or articles you'd recommend for anyone who, now I know a lot of people are like, property taxes, I don't want to read about property, but
I don't know anyone who's like that.
Academics will read anything. One of my favorite classes in graduate school was a public administration class where we learned about like the stools of taxation and how you need
All
to
right,
have,
you're my kind of people.
and I love that stuff. It's like, you should tax everything a little bit so that way you're not overly reliant on any one tax if you have a recession. So I always love stuff like that. But do you have anything you'd recommend for someone who's maybe interested?
Yeah, I would love to recommend a new book by one of my co-authors, Bernadette Atuahene, and her book is called Plundered: How Racist Policies Undermine Black Homeownership in America. And that book is not exclusively, but it's largely about property tax issues. And so, in terms of a book that's more accessible, not a dry, public economics textbook, that I think people will find interesting and will certainly cover the kind of issues that you and I have been talking about today, I would recommend Plundered.
Super. And could you tell us the website one more time?
It's Property Tax Project, all one word, .uchicago.edu.
Thank you so much, Professor Berry. I really appreciate the time. I've learned a lot today. It's been a great conversation.
Thanks for having me on. I'm so glad that we'll be able to talk with your students about these kind of issues, because they are the next generation of homeowners. So I'm glad for them to get a head start on knowing about this.